if I can paraphrase something that he said with regards to education, he said that education is an important element in our struggle for human rights. It is the means by which our people acquire their self-esteem and thereby improve their self-respect. Apropos the comments that you've made with respect to the Freedom School, what do you consider the pitfalls and the challenges that black people have with respect to education presently? Wadley, for example, is a school that has some challenges. There are a number of schools which have predominant populations of people who look like you and I that are under the gun, that are in danger of being closed. Much of the education perhaps is irrelevant. What do you see as the state of education in our communities now, and if there's anything that we can do to improve that state?
All right, I would like to preface that comment. I mean, you quoted Malcolm, and that was a very important quote. Marcus Garvey said, education is a means by which a people are prepared for the creation of their own civilization and for the advancement and glory of their own race. And whereas that might seem like it's a narrow definition of education, basically that's what education is about, should be about, that by going through the process of education, you feel good about yourself, you feel good about your people, you feel good about your race, you feel capable that you're able to do anything and everything within the realm of human possibility. Education in this country has taught us or programmed us to believe the opposite, that we are not capable, that we are inferior, that we do not have the ability to compete on a global basis. And because of that, more and more children are rebelling against being told that they cannot do, that they should not do, that they are incapable of doing. So the situation, the current situation of education today is basically you have a war going on. The people who want to continue to control us, to make us just consumers, or to lead the children into two primary areas, meaning the grave or the prison system, which is the fastest growing industry. So education is actually what Carter G. Woodson called miseducation. And in terms of the miseducation that we receive, the miseducation basically moves us along a path of self-destruction. Let me give just a couple of concrete examples. One example is that education is connected to culture, so that when you learn about the events of the world, the heroes of the world, the sheroes of the world, the things that happen throughout humankind, if you are taught that these particular things did not come from you but came from everyone else, then you have a feeling of inadequacy. So you have a situation in school, well, when I was going to school, and I think it still applies, that when we were taught philosophy, we started off with Greek philosophy in terms of Plato, in terms of Aristotle, in terms of Socrates. But Greek philosophy is basically a distorted, diluted remnant of African philosophy, because the Greeks were students of African philosophy, went to Egypt, Kemet, through the mystery system, learned some of the secrets of the universe, but then began to sign their name to it, and they are held up on a pedestal as the authors or the creators of this particular philosophy. If you deal with math, you have something like a Pythagorean theorem, which was here before Pythagoras, and African people were using this theorem. But when we're sitting up in math, they'll say the Pythagorean theorem, so the culture is attached to the lesson. And so we learn someone else's culture, and actually the fabrication of their relevance to that particular lesson. We learn that, we are programmed by that, and then we come to the point that we are idolizing someone else, and we're wondering, what is our place in society? What is our place on the planet? And basically we come to the conclusion that we have no place, and we begin to engage in self-destructive behavior.
Every time I listen to you, I feel as if I need a tape recorder because it stimulates so many thoughts in my mind. And just in that soliloquy that you just finished, there were several questions that I had intended to ask you, and I'm having to try and regroup on what those questions were. But while I do that, I attended a forum on Saturday at the Schomburg, and in this forum there were a number of brothers there, and one of the things that they lamented was the fact that there's sort of a dichotomy, there's a sort of tension, in his words, that often exists between schools of thought in the black community. For example, you might have the Pan-Africanists on the one hand who have a philosophy, and somehow there's a chasm between their perspective and maybe the black Muslims. Or you might have Christians who might have some problems with maybe some Buddhists. And in the context of that observation, this brother mentioned that Malcolm always said that we were oppressed not because we were Christians or Muslims or nationalists or Pan-Africanists. We were oppressed because we were black people. Mm-hmm. And he lamented the fact that somehow with these different schools of thought and these different ways of looking at things, this chasm hasn't been bridged, and it's been our death knell in many ways. It has prevented us from coming together and realizing the things that we're capable of realizing. How do you respond to that observation, and what can we do to try and pull ourselves together so that we can do what we need to do?
You know, there's a formula to everything. Everything in life that one wants to achieve, there's a formula to achieving it. Whether it's baking a cake, creating, putting a formula together like H2O for water or NaCl for table salt. If you put the proper elements together to create the desired compound, you get what the objective is about. You're able to reach your objective. If you don't put those elements together, no matter how much you desire to reach that objective, you will not reach the objective. Basically, African people need to be free. No matter how much we talk about education, no matter how much we talk about police brutality, no matter how much we talk about the injustices in the court system, we need to be free. It's somebody else's system. It was somebody else's system in the beginning of this particular country, not the land base, but the country was somebody else's system. It is still someone else's system, and that particular system is oppressing us. Most African people do not want to be free. Most African people want to receive benefits from the oppressor, want to be comfortable within a system of enslavement, so that those things that we basically call for are things that will make us comfortable in a prison, make us comfortable in an environment that enslaves us. People who want freedom, they go after freedom. Now, if you don't want freedom, then what you are is not an African nationalist, not even a black nationalist, but you are an American nationalist, because ultimately you want to create an environment in America that's comfortable for you. You want to reform America to make it amenable to a particular lifestyle.
So can I interrupt you and just ask
Sure.
a question? So those persons and those groups who call themselves nationalists, for example, or Pan-Africanists, for example, and get bogged down in ideology and doctrines as opposed to keeping their eyes on the prize of freedom, are really charlatans.
No, this is what I'm saying. I'm saying that if you calling yourself, and not just calling yourself, but acting in a particular way that will describe you as a Pan-Africanist or an African nationalist, etc., that is on point. That is on point. But when you move away from that, that's when you become off center, meaning that these other kinds of things, I won't mention the particular religions, but these other kinds of things, these are areas of distraction. They allow people to be active in something without challenging the basic thing that's keeping us oppressed. Because people around the world who want to be free go after freedom in particular ways. And generally, it's not done through voting. Initially, a voting might be the result after 7 years of armed conflict. But voting is not the initial way people would get freedom. Marching is not the initial way people would get freedom. You cannot vote your way to freedom. You cannot march your way to freedom. You can't sign petitions to get freedom. You can't wear armbands to get freedom. You can't light candles to get freedom. There's one way to get your freedom, and that's to take your freedom. Nobody's preventing us from taking our freedom. No one is preventing us, but it's our will. And that's why Garvey said, up you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will, because whatever we will to accomplish, that we will accomplish. So the objective of the oppressor is to keep us from willing it, to keep us from wanting it, to come in between our will, ultimately our willpower, and who we are. So we operate ultimately against our best interests.
As I said before, whenever I listen to you, it stimulates a number of questions in my mind. So I'm going to skip around a little bit because we'd like to leave time for you to get in to some of your artistic energy. I could ask you to respond to a number of so-called leaders. You mentioned Carlos Cooks, for example. He's my definition of a leader also, and undoubtedly many of the young brothers and sisters who will see this program may not know who Carlos Cooks is. So for a brief moment, I'd like you to respond or tell us who some of these people are. I'd like to ask you, I'd like to mention the names of a couple of people and see if you would just tell us as briefly as you can who these individuals were. And also, what is your definition of a black leader, and do you see any brothers and sisters on the landscape of our struggle today who are in fact living up to that definition of a black leader? Are there any Malcolms afoot? Are there any Garveys afoot? Do you see any brothers and sisters that you would respect in that regard?
So which question first?
Whatever you're
all right.
comfortable with responding to.
Basically, there are a number of individuals that I have respect for who are doing a great work. The time that we are in now is not conducive for the rise of a Malcolm or the rise of a Garvey. The time is conducive for us taking the work of Malcolm, Garvey, Carlos Cooks, Lumumba, and many others, and using that particular work and collectively moving forward and doing what we have to do. There's no real secret for us to become free, as I said before. So at this point, actually, it's not so much a leader has to come forth and say, well, the way to such and such a place is in this particular direction. Most of us, if we have quiet moments with ourselves, know the direction, but we must have the courage of our convictions to take the trip. So what takes place in terms of leadership is that our oppressor made a mistake with Malcolm X by putting Malcolm X on camera, not having the experience before of any black man being on camera in the media and being so eloquent and so dynamic. Once Malcolm used the media to his advantage and our advantage, the system made a determination not to make that mistake again, and has not, so that anyone who comes forward with something to say, with something that will electrify the African world, is not basically put on camera for any length of time. and that person is generally targeted, sometimes killed, but basically character assassinated or whatever other tools of destruction that they might have. So it's not a conducive time, as I said, for people to stand up. So there are other people who are just dealing with work. They get work done because they are not leaders per se. I am not a leader per se, even though some people might consider me a leader of sorts. And I'm not a leader per se because I don't have legions of people following me. One of the reasons why I've been able to do as much as I've done and get as far as I've gotten and to be 57 years old is because a lot of people have not been following me. Had a lot of people been following me, thousands and thousands of people or hundreds of thousands of people, number one, I would have known what to do with those hundreds of thousands of people. And number two, the oppressor would not have allowed me to continue. But right now I can continue. So I know I answered you by the side door. I understand that. But I'm saying there are people with leadership potential but cannot get followings because the system is basically geared and structured and designed to not let that happen.
I would ditto those comments. But can you respond to, for example, the significance, or can you tell us who Carlos Cooks was?
Well, Carlos Cooks was one of the primary leaders, and he predated Malcolm X. Carlos Cooks was born born on June 23rd in 1913 in Dominican Republic or Santo Domingo. He came out of a Garveyite lineage and was knighted by Garvey when he was 19 years old. Was supposed to take over the UNIA, but he was so young that he ran into certain problems and started the African Nationalist Pioneer Movement on his birthday in 1941. As I mentioned before, he's responsible for launching the Buy Black campaign. And basically he was saying that whenever we make up a residential majority in any given community, we should control the economic business life of that community. And there was generally a 90-day plan that if we would not buy from people who didn't look like us, but if they didn't look like, if the people who look like us did not have what we wanted, for us to go outside the community to make the purchase. But by all means, do not support other people inside our own community. And he used, for examples, Little Italy, Chinatown, etc. The ethnic communities that basically control the economic business life of their communities. But with us, by us not controlling the economic business life, we let everybody and anybody in the community to sell to us, to exploit us. And the result, of course, is what we see today with Harlem being taken over as we are having this particular dialogue. So he did that. He also dealt with the instituting the Marcus Garvey Day Parade. And most people know about the West Indian Day Parade, but once again, we are not West Indians. Marcus Garvey happened to come from Jamaica, so we should have one parade. And it predates the others. In addition, he had a Miss Natural Standard of Beauty contest, which was very innovative. That is, giving a prize to African women who had African features. So that the more you had African features and the more you had African consciousness, the more you were likely to win this prize. So the African women who had their hair natural, who had dark skin and full lips and a broad nose, that was the natural standard of beauty, and they would win the prize. Since then, I have not seen that outside of those people who were influenced by Carlos Cooks. And I don't want to take up too much time with this, but in Bermuda once, there was a contest. And the contest, there were 25 contestants in Bermuda. You know, Bermuda is primarily black. 25 contestants. 24 women were black. 1 woman was white. 5 judges, 4 judges black, 1 white. Who won? The white woman. All right? So I'm saying this not in terms of being quote unquote racist, etc., but understanding that we must celebrate our own. We must lift up our own, not to the detriment of anybody else, but we must learn how to love ourselves and stop loving everybody else and hating ourselves. We must turn the love light on each other.
Thank you. Fannie Lou Hamer, W.B. Du Bois, of course, Garvey, David Walker. There's an endless list of black people whose names we may never ever hear of or know. They didn't have followers. They were under the radar, so to speak. But I have immense respect for them because, like yourself, they personified a fortitude, a clarity of vision, and an ability to talk about what we have experienced as a people in such very simple but very profound ways. I often think that if our lives are going to change, we have to somehow make that Parthenon of our heroes accessible to children from birth on. In the European community, every day, those heroes and sheroes, Washington and Jefferson and all of the others, are spoon-fed to them. I don't see that happening to us. I don't see that happening in our communities to the extent that it should happen. Are there any suggestions or any observations that you can make in that regard to engender that?
Well, it's our responsibility to teach our children. It's our responsibility to reteach ourselves. You know, the people you mentioned, everyone had a constituency. You mentioned Fannie Lou Hamer. There's still organizations today under her name, people who were influenced by her and quote her most famous saying, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." One of the people born on October 6th, the same birthday that Henri Christophe, from one of the Haitian liberators, he was born on that same day. But out of all the people you mentioned Marcus Garvey, and Marcus Garvey, of course, had a huge following. He came out of Jamaica. He first started the UNIA in Jamaica in 1914, and came over here in 1916 to meet Du Bois, and to meet Booker T. Washington. But Booker T. Washington died in 1915. So Garvey started the UNIA over here in 1916, but by 1918, going into 1919, he had an organization of 2 million people. He had 3 ships. He had a newspaper with 3 languages, French, English, and Spanish. And basically, he had the black, not just the Black Star Line, but selling stocks to black people, and moving to the point that we were dealing with the level of self-determination and self-reliance. As a matter of fact, Elijah Muhammad was one of Garvey's legionnaires, and many of his ideas obviously were inspired by Marcus Garvey when he stretched out a decade later in the 30s. So we have the responsibility to, yes, teach the history to our children, do it in the home, do it in conversations. We have the responsibility to build our own schools, to have workshops, to deal with it in terms of lectures. We have the responsibility that if we're into rap, to have our rap lyrics, like people like KRS-One or people like Dead Prez, to incorporate some of the history. I think Nas also incorporates some of the history into what we deal with. And ultimately, we have the responsibility to have our own land, because no matter what we do in somebody else's system, it's still somebody else's system. So we can only grow so much or so far. It's like a plant with a low ceiling. You see, this is somebody else that we need to be in our own space. We need to grow into the tree and the forest that we represent, not to be, the house plant in the studio apartment.
When Malcolm was killed, there were roughly 250,000 people, black people, in prison. In 2001, that number is approximately 2 million. And unless you believe that black and brown people have a greater proclivity towards evil or doing wrong,
I don't.
Okay. Having said that, what can we do to kind of remedy this situation? They're increasingly incarcerating brothers and sisters.
Well, once again, we have to have a plan and program that we agree to and that we implement. The increased incarceration of so many of our youth is part of somebody's plan. To have this, the fastest growing industry in America is the prison complex. People are calling it the new plantation. And it is for primarily people of color, or it's for almost exclusively for people of color, generally for African people, meaning black people, and specifically for the young black man, the young black male. But more and more black women are being incarcerated. But the young black man is the most feared person on this planet, because whereas we might not know our own history, other people know our history and know what the young black man is capable of. These people do not want the young black man to become another Lumumba or Carlos Cooks or Malcolm X or Marcus Garvey or Huey P. Newton or Khalid Abdul Muhammad or Alombe Brath or Dr. Jeffries or Dr. Ben or Dr. Clark, etc. Destroying the youth. Not so much in the example of Herod to just, deal with, picking several new black males being born to destroy them, trying to prevent a Messiah from taking place or from coming about, but seeing the possibility of several Messiahs coming about and really attacking, incarcerating, drugging, basically leading our youth into destruction. And this has been going on for some time now, but it's at an all-time high.
I'd like to get into another aspect of your life, that is the creative aspect of who you are. I first heard a poem several years ago when I first came to New York, and I've said this to you on a previous occasions, that the Black Brigade was one of my favorite pieces. It's a classic. That's a rather long piece, but in this interlude, if you will, I would like you to share perhaps a montage of some of your work, if that's not too difficult to ask at this time.
I can do that.
Okay. And if you choose to do it with prose or poetry, I request, of course, the inclusion of some poetry if you would like to do something other than poetry, because I'd like for those of us who are here to hear that voice that is yours.
All right, I'll do a few short poems. The first poem I'll do is called The Choice Blues, basically because we have a choice of who we are, what our mission happens to be, or whatever mission we choose to take on. And sometimes we have to understand that we're born on a battlefield. We should understand this. And when you're born on a battlefield, the choice is either to be a warrior or a target. That's the choice. And I made that choice at one point in my life. If I were not at war, I would be in love. But infinity lives between bloodshed and bliss, that is between the kill and the kiss, as I attempt to simultaneously insulate my house for the winter and ventilate it for the summer. I mean, it can be done, but it takes some doing. That is, these are the days of winter as cold warfare waxes hot, and subliminal burns on scorched skin culminate in camouflage cremation. I mean, one can live without love, but one cannot love without life. And whereas the former is debatable, the latter is definitive. So I make my choice to kill in the war of winter, that I may kiss in the peace of spring. I'd like to do another one. We talked about the prison system. So this one is dealing with, very short one, dealing with the chances that we have when we go into the justice system. And it's called the USA Court of No Appeal. The USA Court of No Appeal. A magazine jury of 12 rounds, a prosecuting trigger and forefinger judge, a witness box casket on a tombstone stand, the accused found guilty of melanin in the first degree, a death verdict in a graveyard court, injustice sustained, objection overruled. And maybe this final one, this final short one. The people who have given up, the people whose lives do not reflect the fact that we're in a land of oppression, the people who have actually stopped struggling, who have capitulated, people who have been compromised. This is just called the obituary. Series of questions. Who silenced the cry for freedom? Where did the struggle go? What void contains the corpse of revolution? Who made formaldehyde our beverage of choice and changed our anthem to taps? Is it the carcass of courage I smell, or the decomposition of destiny? When was the magic replaced by maggots? And why do we fatten the worms?
Good afternoon. Welcome to Conversations at Wadley. Our guest today is Brother George Edward Tait, a wordsmith, a freedom fighter, a critical thinker. It's my pleasure to welcome him and our audience to Conversations at Wadley. Conversations at Wadley has been a meeting place for a number of brothers and sisters who have articulated our experiences in a most profound and significant way. Marcus Garvey once said, "Now we have begun to speak, and I am only a forerunner of an awakened Africa that shall never go back to sleep again." When Marcus Garvey spoke those words were meant to extol the virtues of a brother such as this warrior that sits in our presence today. He is a poet, he is an educator, he is a man of letters, he is a musician. Today is Friday, May the 25th. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to Conversations at Wadley.
It's my honor to be here.
Brother Tait, I'm gratified and humbled by your presence. I'd like to begin with a reference to a brother whose birthday was celebrated last Saturday. As you know, last Saturday was Malcolm X's birthday.
Yes.
Malcolm was our living courage, our living manhood. And when I think of Malcolm, I tend to measure the lives of many of our so-called leaders by the standard that Malcolm set. If you would, could you please assess Malcolm's importance to the struggle and liberation of black people in this country, and indeed throughout the diaspora?
Well, Malcolm X was extremely significant, one of the most significant leaders of the 20th century. And to understand the level of his significance, one needs to go back to the time that he emerged as a leader. And that was in the very, very late 50s, very, very early 60s. We're talking about 1959, 1960, 1961, 1962 when he emerged. At that time, at that particular juncture in our history, there was very little evidence of leadership. We had people, to be certain, people, magnificent individuals like a Carlos Cooks and others who were in the community. But the focus of the community was not on liberation. The focus of the community was not on moving forward and improving in any kind of African context. So consciousness, nationalism was basically part of a small group of people who had the wisdom, the understanding enough to read, to study, etc. Malcolm came along and made it popular. He made it popular because TV cameras assaulted him. And when TV cameras assaulted him, he defended himself with such brilliance, such intelligence, such manhood, and as you said, such courage, that what happened was that we received on television a great representative of African people, and we felt inspired by it.
Apropos those comments, I've never known you to punk out. I came to New York about 15 years ago, and you've always been in the vanguard of our struggle. And as I said before, I've never ever known you to punk out about anything. What gave you your voice? You could just as easily have become someone whose highest aspiration was to wear a Rolex watch or Brooks Brothers suit. But somehow there was something within you or within your experiences that led you down a different path. It caused you to become the person that you are. And what were those factors?
Well, everyone has a particular path, so it's my understanding and my position that this is part of my path. In addition, my father was an African nationalist. My father was a Garveyite. I didn't know it coming up in the Lincoln Projects. I wasn't aware of this. But I came across some of his writings that he wrote for the African magazine. He eventually became managing editor of the African magazine. And in his writings, he called for things like the Buy Black campaign in 1938 that Carlos Cooks actually launched in the 40s. He basically was able to clearly analyze what was going on a community basis as well as on a global basis. So that was in my blood, but it was dormant. And when I heard Malcolm X, and when that was reinforced by the cubs of Carlos Cooks, people like Olombe Brath and others, then I became fortified to the point that nothing will shatter me. It's part of me, it's inseparable.
Earlier, we were talking about one of the initiatives that you started about 10 years ago, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. That initiative being, among others, the Liberty Lounge. That institution was a clearinghouse, if you will, for a lot of brothers and sisters who were trying to assess themselves, who were looking at our experiences and our history with critical lenses. There were poets who came through there. There were musicians. The Liberty Lounge still exist in the minds of those of us who knew that experience. And undoubtedly, your mind, why is it that institutions such as the Liberty Lounges of Harlem and others no longer exist in the way that they formerly existed? Is it that we just don't support our institutions? Do these institutions appeal to our appetites, our needs? Why is it that there's been a demise of these kinds of institutions in our communities?
Well, a number of reasons. During the 60s, when certain institutions rose up, cultural institutions, a few educational institutions, what would happen would be those institutions were reinforced by a groundswell of activity, so that if someone had a cultural institution, if someone had a theater, let's say, then that theater would be reinforced by literature that was coming out, by speakers, by representation on the television of people like initially Malcolm X, eventually people like Huey P. Newton and others, and clearly in addition Martin Luther King. So struggle, culture, consciousness, these kinds of things were in the air. So there existed a modicum of longevity. And in terms of a modicum of longevity during that particular period, before COINTELPRO came and really assaulted it and fragmented it, basically people were energized and invigorated. When the Liberty Lounge took place, there wasn't that system where connections took place. So with the Liberty Lounge, it seemed like something that was different than where the community was going or where the community actually was. So there wasn't that much of a support system around the Liberty Lounge. The Liberty Lounge was one of the institutions developed when I was administrator of African Nationalist Pioneer Movement. That organization was initially founded by Carlos Cooks in 1941, and I became the fourth administrator of African Nationalist Pioneer Movement. So the Liberty Lounge was a place where we could have cultural presentations. The people claimed they wanted that, but in an atmosphere that was free from smoke, free from alcohol, free from meat, and basically in a holistic atmosphere, and free from even negative music or negative presentations. So many of the people wanted to have a cultural institutions, but were not ready to change their lifestyle, was not ready to change their patterns of behavior to really support it on that particular level. At the same time, there was also African Freedom School that we initiated, offering courses like aeronautics, metallurgy, agriculture in the community on 125th Street, because these were nation building skills to take us forward, to move us higher. But once again, many of the people were not ready to support that. So basically, yes, it is a memory, but the struggle continues because there are other people doing other things, and we as a people continuously move forward, whether one person is in a quote-unquote leadership role or another. We cannot be stopped.
I ask you to conclude with advice, if you have any, for our young people. What can you say to them that will empower and encourage them to continue the struggle?
Read, research, think, research, read, examine, evaluate, reflect, read, research, read, reflect. Nipsey Russell, the comedian, was on Gil Noble once and was asked about the secret that he had in terms of being able to be an intellectual comedian and not subjecting himself to a lot of the kind of raucous comedy that was and ribald comedy that was prevalent, and how did he have so much knowledge and so much insight, etc. And Nipsey Russell said his secret was the Dewey Decimal System. And basically this is a system that is in most of our communities, or we have access to it, and it's free. We don't have to pay one dime to go in. And the books that will lead us to ourselves, and the books that will lead us to our future. Young people must use their minds. They must think. They must understand that they are born with 100 billion brain cells. And even though everyone loses 100,000 every day, if they live to be 100 years old, they'll still have 96 billion, 350 million brain cells left. That each brain cell could make 60,000 connections. That their brain capacity has been computed to 2.8 times 10 to the 20th power, or having the capacity to read 10 million volumes of books, 1,000 pages each. This is the capacity of the brain. But of course, we are discouraged from reading, and we have to re-energize ourselves, refocus ourselves, because young people, they represent our future. The creativity, the strength, the power, the intelligence, no matter what the young people are doing, is always there. The light is always there. We see that they are brilliant. They have to be directed. They have to learn how to direct themselves. They have to grow. They have to motivate themselves, and we have to help motivate them. And one of the primary things we can do is to not give up. You know, whether we're 57 or whether we're 75, we have to not give up. We have to, in short, lead by example, because they will look at us, and they are looking at us to see what we are doing, and they learn by watching us. So in addition to the books that they are reading, they also read us. So we have to make certain that our book is the book that we don't mind being read by the youth.
Thank you, my brother.
Thank you.
It is said that ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. You've brought some truth to us this afternoon. We appreciate that. We love you. We applaud you. And hopefully you will be gracious enough to come back again.
It would be my honor.